Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to England today, shall we? I like to travel, and I have a good person to go visit. Somebody I'm going to get acquainted with gradually over the next hour that I've wanted to get acquainted with for 30 years or so. He and I are both sort of retired peace studies professors, and we were just commenting on how you can work just as hard after you're so-called retired as before. And this is Paul Rogers. Hello, Paul.
Hello there. Hi.
Great to meet you. I've known about you for many years, and
Yes.
our circles overlap, but we've never met until today. And I set this up because I wanted to get acquainted.
Right.
Paul Rogers is in a building that he describes as an office he's created above his barn, a stone barn in England someplace, and I was speculating about whether he had animals downstairs, but he doesn't. He is a very distinguished professor of peace studies at Bradford University, which is famous for being a center for peace research. It's one of the great places in the world where you can go and study if you want to be a scholar studying peace. And so I want to get caught up with him about what he's been doing lately. In the course of setting this up, I found out that he didn't start off as a peace studies person, but as a biologist. So, Paul, tell me, how in the world did you make a transition from being a biologist to being a professor of peace?
It does sound odd, but when I look back, it seems to me to be quite reasonable. When I finished high school, I went to study in London at Imperial College, and I did a degree in biological sciences, specializing in what they called technical, basically plant technology, which meant sort of more the scientific end of botany. And the group that I was in at undergraduate level specialized in plant pathology, the study of plant diseases. So that's what I did for my first degree. While I was there, I got very interested in development activism. This was the early 1960s when activists were really starting to look at North-South issues. And it was a very active period, a lot of very interesting work going on, a lot of campaigning. And London, of course, was quite a hotbed of it. So I was very lucky in a way. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I was able to get a research assistantship also at Imperial and did a PhD. So I did nearly 3.5 years research for a PhD. It has absolutely nothing to do with peace studies. I was actually doing work on the diseases of potatoes. So basically, my career has gone from potatoes to peace. While I was doing research there, I was very much active in sort of development activism right through. And one of the other students who was also doing a PhD, Claire Skellen, we got to know each other. And in fact, we started going out during that period. At the end of the PhD period, I was really very lucky because they were advertising a couple of very unusual lectureships at Imperial, in which they were paid for by the British Ministry for Overseas Development, as it was then called, and they were known as home-based appointments. And what they did was they funded either universities or research stations to take on some extra staff. And basically, the government funded them when they were working in Britain, but the condition was they had to be prepared to spend up to 80% of the time working somewhere in the global south. And this sort of fitted in absolutely with what I was interested in. And so I had a lectureship at Imperial for 3 years. It was a contract, but I spent 2/3 of the time working in East Africa. Very formative. I mean, I learned a heck of a lot there. It was a plan to develop new varieties of sugarcane, which was suited to the local climatic conditions. They weren't for export. They just weren't producing enough sugar for their own populations, and they didn't want to bring more land out under cultivation or had to put on extra fertilizers. And my job was to set up a small testing station. So any of the new varieties, we could test them for natural resistance to the major diseases and pests. There was a very good young Ugandan plant pathologist who just finished his postgraduate training. And basically, he took over from me. So I set it up and then handed it over to him. So it was an extraordinary opportunity. Although I was based partly in Nairobi in Kenya, I spent most of my time in Uganda. and my boss, the plant breeder, was in Mombasa, 700 miles away. So it was a sort of a distant relationship, but a nice one as well. But because I had to survey all the different disease problems right throughout East Africa, and sugarcane was grown in rather different ways with different varieties in about 10 different places. And so it's a lot of travel, almost entirely by road, mostly on laterite, Murram roads, not on tarmac. And as I say, it was an extraordinary learning experience. I hope it contributed a bit. It taught me in every way that I could, including having to hire and look after staff and equip a small lab and set up field trials. So
to be an administrator, you learned in the field.
You learnt in the field, yes. But the lovely thing
did you catch any viruses on these sugar canes, or
yes, we had a rather nasty virus called ratoon stunt virus, which basically didn't seem to harm the original plants. But the way with sugarcane is you grow it, then chop it off at the ground, and it throws up further crops. They're known as ratoon crops. And basically, these plants, which would normally be slightly less yield than the original plant crop, they were far lower yield if they had this virus. And that was a really tricky one. And there were one or two other problems as well. And there were pests as well. We had insects as well. What was lovely about it was that I was also I was only about 10 miles from Makerere College, the single university in Uganda, and they had a very good agricultural economics and rural development set up. And I used to go to seminars there. So I was able to learn a little bit about on the economic side, which I was far more interested in. And I really got interested in conflict over resources and food security. Claire, my wife, and we did a crazy thing. We got engaged a few weeks before I went abroad for 2 years. Because
she didn't go with you?
Well, she came over twice, but we didn't get married then because her father was very elderly and there was no other family. So basically she came, in fact, she bought him, he was 18. He came over as well for a month. So she came out a couple of times. And when I got back to Britain, I could have extended my contract by a small amount, but I was really much more interested in this new area. And I was very lucky, I had another stroke of luck in that Claire lived up in West Yorkshire. In fact, the cottage I mentioned at the start is where we live. Her grandfather had bought it 90 years ago. So we moved into her place and I was able to get a lectureship at one of the new polytechnics, which were just being set up. Pedagogically fascinating places because they were funded to do experimental courses. They wanted to develop a degree in human ecology, which combined ecology, human physiology, economics and politics, all in a single degree.
Wow.
Absolutely fascinating. And so I took up the job and stayed there 8 years and ended up sort of teaching in development studies and conflict studies. It's crazy in a way, but in those institutions at that time, they could do things which a conventional university wouldn't dream at. They try new things out. We had
I love the idea that of combining the social sciences with biological science, because it at least it prepares one's head for the kind of system thinking that I think right now peace researchers should be making headway on, that we really need to think much more. And in the book that the manuscript that you sent me, part of which you sent me, I was pleased to see that you're thinking along those lines, that we have to recognize that there are so many different projects that are all interdependent and work together, and we need to see ourselves on the same team.
Very much so, yes. And I mean, I still think one of the most remarkable books of the 20th century was Limits to Growth. The first systems analysis of the world system as a whole. I think Donella Meadows, who was the leader of the 4-person team with her husband, Donald, and a couple of others down at MIT, I think she was a remarkable woman. I mean, she, to my mind, was one of the 2 great environmentalists from North America, the other, of course, being Rachel Carson. Extraordinary people, but she thought system. It was very sad because both of them died quite soon after their main books were published, which I think is tragic.
Donella Meadows died.
She died. No, she died just a few years later.
That's what I thought. She lived to recently.
No, it was some little time ago, I think, actually.
Was it? Okay.
Certainly. I mean, she was there for the controversy. I don't think she saw the 21st century. I'm not sure. I may be wrong on that. Her
Well,
husband
I
didn't
tell
get
you why I reached that conclusion. I saw a video, and of course, the videos don't tell you when they're made,
no,
and
no,
it could have been made a long time ago.
yeah,
I
yeah,
assumed it was a recent one, but
yeah.
okay.
I may be wrong on that. Certainly, Dennis Meadows was certainly active for many years afterwards, after the original
Oh,
publication.
okay.
Of course, that was what 50 years ago, nearly. Yeah.
Well, I think the thing about that book is it posed the question
Mm.
and drew it to public attention how much growth we could have. And I frankly think that is still a good question. I mean, I don't see it as a closed, I doubt that that the answer is as simple as all that. I
No.
think there are ways in which growth can continue,
Yeah.
uh, and not be depleting all the world's resources.
And
But
also,
that's
you can, yeah, yeah.
maybe
You
we don't want to talk about that today, but it is the
no, but I
topic.
mean, the other side is you can have prosperity without growth. And
Yes.
I mean, there's so many alternative, well, many different possibilities, certainly. Yeah.
I'm trying right now to set up a talk show with a guy who has written, I think that was the title is of an article I just read, I think in the Atlantic. Can we have prosperity without growth?
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, that's certainly a live topic, I
Yes.
think.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So from development, you go into peace. Now, the next step along your trajectory had to be uh, dealing with conflicts.
Yes. Well, I joined the Peace Studies Department in '79. It had been going about 5 years. It was very small, very much in turmoil because the original professor, a marvelous person, Adam Curl, who'd gone to Bradford from Harvard, was a Quaker and a practitioner. And he basically did not like assessment. And so the students had a huge amount of freedom to do what they wanted to do. And the problem was that does not fit easily within a university because the university didn't quite see life that way. And also quite a lot of students did tend to fall by the wayside a bit. And when I joined it, Adam retired through ill health, although he stayed with good links with the department for many years afterwards.
Mhm.
And his place was taken by James O'Connell, who was actually a former Catholic priest who was a professor of government at Ahmadu Bello University in Nigeria. And James was from Southern Ireland, from the city of Cork, a Republican city. And he had no great love for the British establishment, but he was quite, basically, he wanted to make the department more academic, but not lose its radical tinge. It was a very difficult period, but in the end, it did succeed, I think. The department expanded in the 1980s and basically developed in many different ways and very quickly came up against the Thatcher government, which hated that kind of thing. And we were very quickly known as the Department of Appeasement Studies.
Okay, I get it.
But because I sort of had a biological background, and one of my colleagues who I worked with a lot, Malcolm Dando, was originally a neurophysiologist. And at the start of the 80s, you remember the huge concern over nuclear issues with the expanding Cold War and Reagan and Thatcher.
And I remember that.
Yes. Well, there were very few independent academics in Britain who could do the sort of more independent critical analysis. So we, along with a very good peace scholar, Peter van den Dungen, wrote a book.
I know Peter. Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, we wrote a book called As Lambs to the Slaughter, The Facts About Nuclear War. And that became a bit of a bestseller, but it was factually accurate. And we always put down all we knew about Chinese and Soviet and other systems. It wasn't just hammering the West, which made it more difficult for others, sort of, if you like, the more conventional people, if you like, to basically denigrate it, because we learned to be pretty effective researchers. You had to, because everything you did was subject to really very tough criticism.
Now, what was controversial about your book?
Well, basically, because we were saying these are the armaments, this is a sheer number of them, and this is what would happen in a nuclear war, and these would be the casualties. That, you know, if Britain
that's not controversial. That is very clear, you know.
But it was very controversial politically. And you know, politicians hated this stuff because they claimed that we were almost the research arm of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And the reality was that we probably were. But the point is that it was a necessary role. The two difficulties with it. One is, I mean, there were just 3 of us out of a staff of 12 or so, others doing incredibly good work in many other areas. But it was the work that we did which made the department notorious. And that was difficult. I mean, in fact, our colleagues were very good about it. But, you know, if you're working in, say, an area like peace building or mediation or gender and conflict, then at that time, the media didn't want to know. They wanted to know all about this stuff on nukes and the rest. We did some
Were
critical
you
work.
the were you the only peace studies department or university in England?
No, there was the Richardson Institute at Lancaster University with Paul Smoker, pretty small and part of a bigger politics department, but effective. There was some individual, some very good individual scholars. And down at Sussex, you had the Armament and Disarmament Information Unit, which is a very good source of material. And of course, you had the famous biological arms control specialist, Julian Perry Robinson there, the husband of Mary Calder, who's a well-known peace researcher.
Yes, he died about a year, less than a year.
He died of COVID, sadly, yes. April of last year. It was absolutely tragic. So there were others, but Bradford was pretty quickly the biggest. And we did everything from undergraduate through to PhDs, which wasn't too common. We weren't big. I mean, we only had maybe 150 or so students much of the time. And it tended to be rather understaffed because, of course, the staff, as you find, were doing a lot of very good work with activists. So they were sort of almost doing, you know how it is, doing almost double the load. And,
absolutely. I was one of those, you know, I probably spent more time giving, that's probably not true, but I could imagine that I spent more time giving public lectures, you know, in somebody's basement than I did teaching in my classroom in those days.
But you had to do the academic work. So, I mean, one of the things that we did a lot of was what we called double publishing. You do an academic study on a particular theme, which also had a lot of public relevance, and then you basically convert it into maybe a short policy paper to put to politicians and a campaigning thing as well. So it meant that you were doing a lot more work, but it was incredibly, it was exciting to do. And we attracted some very good research students, some of whom are now in very senior positions.
Yes, I've met some of your graduates, or the people at least who studied for a while at Bradford. Yeah, it must have been exciting.
Good. I mean, my second PhD student was Saif Erekat, who of course went on to be the chief negotiator for the Palestinians with all the negotiations with Israel.
Really?
He sadly died of COVID just a few months ago.
Oh, really?
Yes, absolutely, which was a disaster. So we attracted very good students, and as I say, we had to be very accurate academically, which was very good for us. I think it produced a better department. And we survived the 80s. The Prime Minister did actually try to close us down, but there's no direct way of doing it, because when a group of senior academics were asked to look at us, they did so and gave us a clean bill of health, which was infuriating for the government at the time. But at the end of the 80s, things moved on a lot. And I mean, that meant that, you know, the work that Sarah Perigo was doing in political theory, peace theory, Tom Woodhouse and the group on conflict resolution, and that work really flowered hugely in the 1990s.
You know, I don't think we had that much opposition here. What I do remember was only when I organized the Peace and Conflict program at my college, which is a suburban campus of the University of Toronto. And I just went around to different departments and looked at the program and talked to people teaching courses, decided, could I put these together as a package and then teach some core courses that were basic? And everybody was glad to play, except the political scientists. That's the only opposition that I encountered, was people would say, you can't count a political science course toward this stupid program of yours.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
but politically, I didn't have anybody say that this was a bad idea. I mean, it would be like telling you that health is a bad thing, you know, so close down the medical school.
Well, yes. I mean, you make that comparison. But the 1980s in Britain, you had Margaret Thatcher in charge, and it was very ideologically driven. I mean, it was basically the first phase of the neoliberal transition, as you had with Reagan. And you were in Canada, not the United States. And there were certainly problems in the United States with some of the peace scholars and the attitude of the Reagan administration. that we had it pretty big. It did ease up towards the end of the 1980s. And the curious thing is, though, political scientists were often very suspicious. The rather broadly based international relations people, rather less so. And you had some very good peace scholars working individually in British universities, and you still have. I mean, I was actually chair of the British International Studies Association for a couple of years, and nobody thought it was odd to have a professor of peace studies there. But it would be more difficult to sort of head up the Political Studies Association in Britain, I think.
Right. When we started a program here at U of T and raised funds for a Department of Political Science, I mean, peace studies, but somehow in the way the wheels turn, it was all turned over to the political science department. So the only people teaching the peace studies program are political scientists, and it's administered as sort of a sub branch of the political science department, which I think is a pity, because it really needs to be very interdisciplinary.
Yes, well, that is something like the situation at Lancaster. Although at Lancaster, they also have the Political Studies Science Department as part of a bigger department, which includes religion. And so they have a dimension there, which basically cuts across to peace studies. But no, I think that certainly would have been the situation we found. The one advantage we had was that the department was originally set up in the early 70s. The university got its status from a College of Technology in '66, and its first vice chancellor, president, was Ted Edwards, known as Red Ted. And he was a real educational revolutionary, and he wanted to set up interdisciplinary departments. We set up one of the first ever management schools, I think the first European Studies school, the first international development school. They were all set up before peace studies. And then in '73, a Quaker group came and said, we will raise money to help you set up a peace studies department. And Ted said, yes, of course. And his deputy, Robert McKinley, was a Quaker. So we didn't have a political studies department at Bradford, never. They were not conventional departments, and that was a huge advantage.
That is interesting. Well, you know, Canada has a lot of Mennonites.
Yes.
And I would say there are Mennonite colleges, more than one in Canada, that do peace studies. I don't think there's a Quaker college. I don't even know whether there's a Quaker college in the world. Oh yes, Swarthmore is at least one, isn't it? Yes. Yeah.
And there are one or two others in the States as well. But I mean, there's a Mennonite center at Waterloo, and that certainly has peace studies groups. I remember doing some talks there.
Yes.
So yes, I mean, there's certainly that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a Menno College someplace, I think, in Manitoba.
Yeah.
Well, so we sort of, it's interesting to compare notes, because I wasn't, you know, I haven't ever visited your university, and it's, although I certainly got acquainted with Mary Calder quite well.
Oh, yeah.
I was very active in the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, which she ran for a long time. So I even invited her here once for a good event, but I gather she's retired and but still doing good work.
Oh, yes, she is. Yes, yes. I mean, you know, you're in this lovely position. I did 6 years as head of department in peace studies, and that was pretty rough, I must admit. But now you know, you can get on with your own work, no management responsibilities, no administration, just get on with it. I mean, I think I'm incredibly lucky, I must admit. Okay,
so you're now writing, or you're actually rewriting a book that you published, what, 20 years ago or something?
Oh, yes, 20 years ago, yes, yes.
Okay, let's talk about it, because I think you've got 3 different themes, and I think that you're absolutely right. There are 3 things that are likely to threaten the course of civilization, if not the survival of our species. So let's talk about those 3 challenges.
Well, what happened was I was working in the 90s on the way in which paramilitary groups were developing. I got very interested in that because, of course, we had the Provisional IRA in Britain, and they had started their economic targeting in London, which was not aiming to cause huge casualties, but was basically to undermine the state of the City of London. And privately, we knew it's being quite effective. And it seemed to me that if you're developing this idea that there are some basic issues, you know, economy, environment, and security, which are all troubled paradigms, then essentially that suggests that you're going to get more revolts from the margins, because people will be more marginalized if an economy is not working in a just way. And if this is in a type of environmental limitation, when the natural thing when you face threats is to call in the military, is a recipe for disaster. So towards the end of the 1990s, I sort of started to write in this area, and I thought, well, let's have a go at trying putting it together. So I wrote this book, Losing Control. And that was basically saying that, these are the problems we face, but what is also happening, and I borrowed a phrase that an American naval officer had used, that this is an era where the weak can take up arms against the strong. And that really struck me. And the event which basically illustrated that was the first attempt to destroy the World Trade Center back in February '93, which people tend to forget. And that was an attempt to actually collapse the North Tower right across the Vista Hotel into the South Tower and bring the entire edifice down, which would have killed 30,000 people. It didn't work, and as one engineer said, slightly tongue-in-cheek, the bombers who carried out this attack knew all about very big bombs, but they were not structural engineers. And they should have had several smaller bombs rather than one big one, because that was the structure of the towers. We were very lucky. Everybody was very lucky then. But basically, the argument was that something like that will happen in the future. And if it does, then the reaction will be to use maximum force against whoever is responsible. So it was sort of a prediction of the war on terror in a way. And the book was published. It came out in, I think, 2000, to pretty poor reviews in the academic field, because people thought this was we were into the new era of the world order, new American century and all that stuff. And this was really rather irrelevant.
Excuse me, why would that be so surprising? Because already the Vietnam War was being won by almost barefoot soldiers, and they won. That's just flat out, they won.
Yes, but I mean, basically, the official military line at the time was they won because we weren't able to fight hard enough. We couldn't use all the weapons we wanted. They had their answer for it. Yes, it's nonsense, but they had the answer. And of course, you then had Iraq in '91, which, quotes, laid the ghost of Vietnam, because that showed that modern technology, shock and awe bombing would work. And Saddam Hussein was brought to book. But I didn't hold that. And I mean, other people didn't. I mean, in the run up to that war, there were some Americans at the War College saying this was dangerous and it wouldn't work, as there was in the run up to 2003. So it seemed to me we were getting it wrong and we need to rethink security. Where the book was weakest, I think, was it didn't look enough at the nature of the military industrial complex and military culture. So anyway, it didn't do very well. And then after 9/11, the publisher said, can you add a chapter quickly, just to bring it up to date? And I did, and that took off, and it went through sort of foreign language editions, Chinese and Japanese and the rest, because it seemed to at least strike a chord to some extent. And then obviously that sort of thing got submerged in many other books coming out at that time in the early 2000s. And I did a further edition, which was just a couple of extra chapters about 7 or 8 years later. That was all sort of 10 or 12 years ago, and the world had moved on. So I talked to the publishers and they said, yes, do a 4th edition, but you really need to rewrite it. And so that's what I've done. So although it has all the original analysis in it, which I would still hold to very largely, I think I've tried to improve it through to 2000 and then really update it in terms of what's happened over the last 20 years, which has been quite staggering when you look at it.
Well, I think there certainly is room for a whole reanalysis of military strategy based on the reality that the source of insecurity is not what we have always assumed it was. I remember a conversation I had with Grigory Yavlinsky in Russia. He was the head of the Yabloko party. He was an economist under Gorbachev and continues to be very active as a political. And he was, I loved the analogy he gave. You're out fighting a war and you've got all these artillery and mass, things, and your real enemy is the mosquitoes.
Yes. Absolutely.
What are you going to do with it? Your guns are no good against mosquitoes.
Well,
So
I mean,
that's, what you're pointing out is sort of the same thing, that the real problems that we have to deal with are many of them you can't begin to solve with guns.
Well, I mean, after all, you can't nuke a virus. It's irrelevant.
Right.
The military have a role in logistics, and
Yeah,
you're having all the aircraft carriers in the world won't stop climate breakdown,
that's
and they
right.
won't do much to help. So,
That's
I mean, there's so much, but I mean, you have this whole military-industrial complex. I mean, Eisenhower was the one who sort of favored that term, although I think, in fact, military-industrial academic bureaucratic complex is more accurate. Uh,
okay.
because it's very, and any country with any kind of armed forces of any size will have a military industrial complex. I mean, Canada certainly has one. And
Sure.
you'll have the university departments, which are partly funded by the Defense Ministry and get money from the arms companies. You'll have the think tanks, and you will have the extraordinary revolving door. I mean, one of the odd things was when I started working in this field, right back in the controversial period in the early Thatcher years, I was getting invites to lecture at the main defense colleges very frequently. And I still do nearly 40 years later, because they're interested. But it meant that I've been able to get a much better understanding of how military systems work and how people think. And by and large, the British military are very good at looking ahead. But the problem, they see their role as defending the realm, not preventing problems developing in 10 or 20 years' time. So they look at how they're going to help the country respond to climate breakdown, not how to prevent it happening.
I believe, I understand that the Pentagon has been seriously looking at climate change issues for a number of years, in ways that maybe the general public isn't aware. In fact, probably it's to their advantage to not have it too well known, because there's so much opposition. Some politicians in Washington will say, you're not allowed to do this research. So the Pentagon forges ahead, but I don't know we don't know what they're saying, really.
No. Well, we have the Ministry of Defence in Britain has a think tank called the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, and that's done some very interesting work on world futures. But again, it comes down to, do you protect the country, or do you actually prevent it happening so you don't even have to protect the country? And we're 20 years late on resolving that, I'm afraid. So the security dilemma, I'm basically what I call the control paradigm, or more crudely, lidism. Lidism is where you keep the lid on the problem rather than turning down the heat.
I liked your terminology. No, tell me why, what do you think they would do to protect the country if their concern is global warming? I don't see how any military actions really can do a thing.
Well, I'll give you an answer sort of anecdotally. 6 or 7 years ago, I had an invitation out of the blue from the people who run the Changing Nature of Warfare at Pembroke College in Oxford. It's been supported by foundations, very interesting outfit. And they said they were running a seminar on the security problems to Britain of weak and failing states. How would the existence of weak and failing states affect Britain? And could I come and do a sort of bit of a broad brush overview of what was happening worldwide? This would have been about 2013, 14. And then they had a whole string of really good experts on particular regions. And it was a lovely opportunity for me, because I could just speak for 20 minutes and set a scene and then listen to this sort of galaxy of experts going through all the details. But they weren't actually that keen on telling me exactly the audience. I assumed it was probably a Foreign Office audience. And when I got down there, it was a one-day thing. So I went down the night before, had a drink with the organizer, and explained, no, the audience is the commandant and all the senior officers of the Special Air Service, the SAS, plus the Special Boat Service and MI6 and others. So in other words, it was Britain's elite special forces. And they apparently had these seminars occasionally to look long-term at what they had to do and what their role would be in sorting out security threats. And as they accepted, one of those would come from climate breakdown, making states unstable. So that's the kind of answer you would get from the special forces, the ones whose job it is to go into these areas and basically sort them out.
I hope that you told them yes, the best thing you can do is take most of your money and devote it to
Well, I
the other
did.
projects that we have in
Yeah.
mind that have to do with studying what to do about the methane coming up out of the Arctic Ocean. Let's say that's
Yeah,
my
no.
top priority.
Well, I did, but I sensed that over the dinner that evening, the ones I was talking to didn't really want to take on board that particular message. But at least you have the opportunity to say it. So I mean, I know it's a long-winded.
Excuse me, when you tell them something using words like military industrial complex or military industrial academic complex, how do they react? I mean, they
Well,
must
I
run
think
into that.
I think they will get it. I mean, you're dealing with people who, if I talk at defence colleges, they're people at lieutenant colonel level or above. So they're high flyers. The Royal College of Defence Studies, which is the elite one in Britain, has about 40 or 50 British people, and then a similar number from all the way around the world. And most of those will go to the top eventually. And they're also sufficiently of sufficiently high rank not to worry too much about saying things different themselves.
Mhm.
There is a certain basically space for disagreement. But when push comes to shove, you're in the system, and the system works in a particular way. You have your revolving door, so the civil servants might join, be seconded to defence industries and vice versa. If you're the number of heads of defence colleges I've seen retire and then go into lucrative consultancies with arms companies, as do politicians. The whole thing is a closed system, which is very difficult to break out. And as one activist said, of course, the whole thing is imbued with hegemonic masculinity right the way through the system.
Well, I have friends who teach in the Royal Military College or the elements of it, and they are peace people, but they get away with it because what they deal with is peacekeeping.
Yes.
So as long as you focus on peacekeeping,
Okay.
you've got an area that's acceptable.
Yes. Now that's not so easy in Britain because Britain has not been very active in peacekeeping. It doesn't have the level that Canada has done in the past.
Well,
or a country
Canada
like
certainly doesn't do in the present, though.
No, I had all that controversy, didn't you? Yes. Yeah. I mean, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, I think, has had peacekeepers active for 36 of the last 40 years. And it has huge experience. But the British Army, it's not proper soldiering. There are exceptions, and I don't get me wrong, because there is new thinking going on. And there was actually rather more under the last Labour government, but it's not rude. Britain, our problem was we lost an empire, and we think we've still got it. Like the French, we're two nuclear powers with delusions of post-imperial grandeur, and that really is solid right across the culture, I'm afraid. And the military inevitably will reflect that to an extent, but as I say, there are many very bright people there as well.
Well, I'm thinking that, one basis for moving the ideology of the military would be Mary Kelder's notion of the new wars,
Yes.
which are different from the conventional things that military people think they're fighting.
Yes.
And that's certainly much more relevant to what is going on in most of the world today.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, if you look at it dispassionately, we've had 4 seriously failed wars in the last 20 years. Afghanistan is the obvious one, and the Taliban are taking over week by week at present after 20 years. The Iraq war was an utter disaster in so many different ways, and Iraq still is deeply unstable. Libya is a disaster out of all proportions. The wrecked country, and the way that it has provided a funnel for all kinds of things to develop across the Sahel, where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are active. And then you have the one which people forget about, and that was this very bitter, intense air war against ISIS between 2014 and 2018, which appeared to completely destroy ISIS. But they got 10,000 paramilitaries still active in Iraq and Syria, and they're active across the Sahel region.
They're even to some extent, I understand, in Yemen.
In Yemen, yes.
Much. No.
Yes, in Yemen and in Libya. And so that's
but you haven't mentioned Syria.
Well, Syria, of course, the West did not sort of, quote, intervene, but did not intervene forcefully to prevent the development of a war. And of course, then the Russians were able to get in and use it to their own advantage.
Mm.
And I mean, but I mean, if you like, the four failed wars were the ones which the West instigated. Those are the ones I was concentrating on. I mean, there are others. I mean, look at the failure in Yemen with the Saudis and the Emiratis. And of course, what's happening in Syria as well. But I was concentrating on the four for which Britain, the United States, and France were responsible, and they have failed. There has been this subtle move, of course. We now move rather in parallel with what Mary's been writing. We're now into the era of remote warfare, where you don't have tens of thousands of boots on the ground. You have special forces, you have armed drones, you have strike aircraft, you have your local militias, you have privatized security companies. There are more private security personnel in Afghanistan than there are American soldiers.
Oh, really?
And of course, most of that is not debated. I mean, Britain in Parliament will not talk about special forces. They will not answer questions on them. You'll leak some very juicy bits of news to the tabloids, but what really goes on is very rare. And this recent study in Australia of the appalling conduct of some of their special forces in Afghanistan is a real exception to what has happened worldwide. I mean, they get away with murder literally in many cases, but it never gets the power. And of course,
I'm a journalist. I run this thing called Peace Magazine, and we have not done anything like an article on special forces. You've just given me an idea. This is something we need to deal with, especially if it's the kind of thing that people don't want to talk about in Parliament.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge area. There's enough work coming out now, and I've written a bit about it, but others have written much more about it. And you know, the American Special Operations Command, one of their big commands, now has 70,000 personnel. So they have special forces almost as large as the British Army, and probably 4 times the size of the Canadian Army, just special forces.
Oh my word! You know, this is. I'm embarrassed to say news to me, but I guess that's sort of what it is. I'm not aware of all that.
I mean, the trouble is there are few people who basically look at the military. They're peace researchers, but they look at the hard end of war. And I've done that a lot. And, you know, it is quite amazing the information that is available there. We had a think tank in Britain called the Oxford Research Group. It's defunct now because it ran out of money, but it's 2 other groups have basically taken over its work. But we ran a program for 7 years it started off being called the Remote Control Project, then it became the Remote Warfare Program. And that published incredible information about, you know, the militias and the privatized security and the rest. Really good, well-referenced work. We had some very good researchers on it. And that was quite eye-opening for many people. And you look at this whole area, but of course the whole thing is, if you have tens of thousands of boots on the ground and you have journalists accompanying them, you know what's going on. If they're special forces and armed drones, it does not get into the public eye at all. I mean, the American Special Force commander said he reckoned they killed 60 to 70,000 ISIS supporters in that war between 14 and 18. But, you know, but none of that was covered in the press at the time.
How can we, you know, I guess I want to know, how can they suppress that kind of information? And maybe it's simply a failing of journalists, that the journalists have not been prodding or, you know, probing sufficiently to bring that thing to public attention. Because I mean, it's bothering me, you know, the fact that this is what I'm supposed to be doing and I'm not doing it.
It should bother us. I mean, I don't know what the Canadian parliamentary system is like, but the British parliamentary system, there is a taboo about answering questions about special forces. Members, you know, quite radical MPs will try, but they just get nil answers. It is not government policy. And the trouble is it's a cross-party thing. But no, I mean, but there are other problems. I mean, journalists working on the military depend so much on the military for their sources that if they start looking at the awkward things, they tend to get frozen out of their normal sources of information. And also, I'm not familiar sufficiently with the Canadian press, but overwhelming the British press is basically right-wing and very nationalistic. And of
Well,
course,
I don't think the Canadian journal, I mean, the Canadian military is doing anything very interesting abroad. There was a group sent to Mali supposed to help
yes, yeah,
there, and I think they've withdrawn them. I don't know, but it was a
yeah,
minor operation anyway. Canadians have not been very active in
yeah,
military activities since withdrawing from Afghanistan.
yeah.
But in the US, I see references to contractors.
Oh,
And I
yes.
don't know what they are, except that I wonder if they are the folks that you're calling special forces.
No, no. Special forces is the technical term for organized military, part of the military who specialize in all kinds of special operations. You then have the private contractors, and they often do either the protecting work, or I have said in some cases they do the particular dirty work. Many of the contractors, so to speak, are actually ex-special forces personnel, who basically, if they leave the army or the Marines, they get very good jobs and pay very well, but they've been working at the sharp end in Afghanistan. And if they get killed, it doesn't attract public attention back home. Whereas, the troops, the dead troops coming back in body bags, that's a serious problem.
But now, wait a minute, these special forces, I'm not sure from what you've said whether they're civilians or are
No,
they part of the military?
the special forces are military. I mean, our main one is the Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS. And there's a marine version, which is the SBS, the Special Boat Service. They number between the two, they only number about 1,000. But they then have a Special Forces support group, which is drawn from our parachute regiment, the Marines, and the RAF regiment, which guards bases. And then you have special units for Special Forces aviation, reconnaissance, and signals. So you're dealing with a low thousands group, very well, incredibly well resourced, but you're probably only dealing with about 3,000 people at any one time. But they're all the military. And while the Special Forces soldiers, the troopers as they're called, when they serve long periods, the officers normally tend to be drawn from the British upper classes, public school educated, and they may do 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years in the SAS and then go on to very senior roles in the army. But they are professionals. Basically the private security contractors are private companies that take out contracts with all kinds of governments to do jobs which can include direct special forces work. And it's a big industry.
Well, I need to get on to finding out more, but thank you for making me aware of something I've been completely unaware of. We just have a few minutes, and I want to go back to the big picture, because your book is really it points out that we have to solve things in all three dimensions: the economy, the environment, and security. And I wonder if you have a game plan. How are we going to go about addressing all of these things in the short interval that I think we have before the world comes to an end or something?
Well, we have 10 years, I think, to get on top of climate breakdown, which is the immediate one. I mean, there may be more really serious pandemics. Well, if you look at the three areas, the essence of it is that the neoliberal transition in economics, which has had ups and downs and it's not complete, basically it's not worked. It's delivering more and more wealth. I mean, our Sunday Times publishes every year the rich list of the billionaires and how they've done. And it was published, I think, 3 weeks ago. And Britain's billionaires increased their wealth in the first year of the COVID pandemic by over 20%. And that's true worldwide. There are about 2,300 billionaires, and they actually increased their wealth collectively in the first 3 months of the COVID pandemic. Because if the market is doing all sorts of things, you can play it and make money out of it. So that is that. But overall, you now have a situation where incredible wealth and incredible political power is in the hands of relatively few people. Our print media in Britain is dominated by 3 billionaire families, the Rothermeres, the Barclays, and the Murdochs. And essentially, with it comes an awful lot of political power. Many people on the far right in Britain were very keen to have Brexit, because that meant that any attempt to get coordinated financial control and regulation would be limited. And in fact, much of the Brexit campaigning was funded by just half a dozen extremely wealthy people in Britain.
That's interesting.
So that's the economic system is not working. And I think people are recognizing this in different ways. The Washington Consensus across the global south hasn't worked. It doesn't mean there hasn't been growth, increases in wealth. The poor haven't got poorer, but the people on the margins, and we're talking about 2 or 3 billion people, are far more marginalized than they were. And this is why you get so many revolts developing. There is some very good new economic thinking going on. We have the New Economics Foundation in Britain and elsewhere. And there are many ways in which you can move back to a kind of a renewed mixed economy with much more concentration on cooperatives and mutuals and the rest. And it can be done, but we're in the early stages of that. The environmental thing, well, as I said, we're 20 years late in getting to grips with that, and it is now incredibly urgent. The good news, and there's a heck of a lot about it around, is that people are waking up. The scientists are much prepared to speak truth to power and tell the politicians as it really is, not trying always to reach a complete consensus among everybody. And most importantly, there are different ways in which we can live in a much more green way. One of our sons is a lecturer in renewable energy resources, is an engineer, and I get a lot of it from him. It is possible, it is so easy now to produce electricity from renewable resources cheaper than coal and oil, and even cheaper than gas. You could do it much faster than we're doing it. And Britain could be the world leader in this, but we're not. But that is hopeful, because I think there could be an incredible transition in 10 years. The military one, the security one, is the real nut to crack, because there you're dealing with the whole idea. If you have a major problem, basically you've got to meet it by maintaining security, maintaining the status quo, not understanding why it's going wrong in the first place. And there's good work going on in Britain. We've recently seen set up a group called the Rethinking Security, the Commission, actually, the Rethinking Security Commission. And basically, the Alternative Security Commission, I get it right now. And that is basically going to do a 3-year study, not as a single book, but as many publications, on how we should rethink what security should mean for Britain. Far more focused on human and common security. And pointing out that, the biggest security threat that Britain has experienced in the last 18 months has been a pandemic. And we've been very bad about handling it. We weren't ready for it because we weren't thinking it as, you know what I mean? There's so much that we could be doing.
Right. Now, I wonder, I always think it's easy for us to say, let's take money from the military and put it into health or education or poverty reduction or all these other infrastructure, all these other things that we need to spend money on. And absolutely. But I think in the same sentence, we should say, and here's where we're going to create jobs in these areas. Yes. Because I think the problem is the blockage is not just ideological, some military people just thinking in old-fashioned ways, but there's their real interests of jobs, and as well as the interests of people investing in corporations that make components of these things and so on. So I would love to, we are having, for example, here in Canada, there's been a dispute that's gone on for maybe 5 years or now. Canada is selling, has a big contract to produce armored personnel carriers for the Saudis. Right. Of all people. Well, the Canadian population is sick and tired of the idea. I mean, they know what kind of people the Saudi government consists of, but nobody can make any headway because it would be such a big financial loss to give up this big contract. And I think that unless we say, here's what should be done in that factory to create, it used to be a factory that made trains. Yeah. Well, why don't we go back to making a good train? Yes. that kind of thing. I think we need to focus on alternative financial arrangements that hold in place all of these security.
And the thing is, many of the technologies that are used in producing military goods are very good technologies for doing all kinds of other things as well. I mean, our main yard, which builds our nuclear submarines, we just have one yard that does it. It used to build warship, it used to build cruise ships, merchant ships. But this whole area, I agree absolutely with you. arms conversion and defense diversification. For a start, that's how you will get the unions to support you. And they won't otherwise, because they've got their members' interests at heart. Absolutely right, is what you would expect. But the reality is, when you look into the work which people have done on arms conversion, you find that if you're investing a given amount of money in the military, you'll produce maybe, say, so many jobs. If you invest in virtually everything else, you will produce more jobs. And that's a very powerful thing. But yes, you're not going to get it. But you're saying about taking money from the military budgets aren't massive. You know, I mean, the richest 1,000 people in Britain, their collective wealth is 700 billion pounds. The cost of the military each year is about 45 billion. So, I mean, I think the much more important thing is to get better wealth distribution there. But of course, dear old Boris Johnson in Britain has just taken about a quarter of the aid budget and by sheer chance increased the military budget by the same amount at the same time.
Is that what he's going to, is that part of the thing about the Trident missiles and so on?
No, I mean, they're going to make Trident anyway. I mean, it's a grotesque system. You know, I mean, Britain doesn't need nuclear weapons.
No.
In my book, there are only 9 nuclear weapon states if you include North Korea. And in my book, the way you should think of all those states is they're actually rogue states. Any state which has as one of the bases of its defense the willingness to kill millions of people in a matter of hours could not be considered civilized. Full stop, in my view.
All right. Yeah. We ought to have a bumper sticker to that effect. I think. Yeah. Okay. So we've got to get all of this through. How are we going? I think the problem is, to my mind, getting the political will to support all of the changes that you have said. Because if you do a poll, people are on our side. They'll say, in principle, we agree. You know. Then if you probe them further, and they have to answer questions about how we're going to get there, and what are some of the changes that need to be made. And there's just not the kind of agitation that needs to be done to demand these changes.
But don't you think that here is where academic researchers are both very important and are irresponsible if they don't work towards this sort of end? I mean, I don't know, I'm not up to date with the Canadian university system. Ours has become a lot more bureaucratic than the rest, but academics normally still have some time in the year to do their own work. And they still have a degree of freedom into what they research. And it seems to me that them and think tank people and activists, so my definition of prophecy at the current position is prophecy is suggesting the possible. And what we have to do essentially is look forward to what needs to be done and work out how we might be able to do it and take examples of where it's being done already and sort of put that together as the kind of proposal which will help get us out of the mess. So that, you know, if things become more and more difficult, and I'm afraid they will be, then people will know, yes, there are other ways forward. They have been worked out and we've got to do it. We might therefore do it early enough to prevent a real catastrophe. I think that kind of work is absolutely critical at present.
Yes, and that's what you and I've been doing. But how much do you feel euphoria about your success? I don't, frankly.
No.
I don't feel that when I put information out there, it goes thud. You know, I mean, it just doesn't, I don't get that many people excited and interested and engaged with some of the issues that I think have to be part of the public discourse. And that to me is the real challenge. We've got to change people's heads, you know.
And we've got to get better at it. And we just have to learn, and maybe, you know, some of us concentrate more on other areas than others, and everybody realize they're part of a bigger thing. But, you know, I mean, when push comes to shove, you either do that or you don't do anything and just watch, and that's not on either. I started working on nuclear issues, 40 years ago, and then sort of moved from that almost seamlessly to working on new kinds of wars and political violence. And I've done that for the last 20 years or so. If you spend 40 years doing that, you only have 3 choices in life. You're either an alcoholic, suicidal, or optimistic. And to my mind, you know, I don't drink much, I'm not suicidal. So yes, you are, because things can change so quickly. You know, if we were having this conversation on major threats in 1984, when we faced the possibility of worldwide nuclear war, we wondered whether we'd even get to 1990. And we did get out of that. We're not out of the woods, but we're not, the risk of an all-out nuclear war is lower than it was 40 years ago.
There are people, I think William Perry would say it's higher. I
well,
don't.
a worldwide war, I think probably less. The risk of nuclear weapons being used, to use that terrible phrase, small nuclear wars in far off places, yes. And obviously, if you get an era of an upside down world made worse by climate change, then anything goes. But I'm talking about the idea of a sudden, complete catastrophe. There has been enough de-alerting, but it's a tight call.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no alternative to keep going. And remember that, I mean, there've been huge human progress as well. Look at the progress on basically, well, sexual rights and the changes in even the last year or two, the further changes in race issues with Black Lives Matter. We also, I mean, I think back to my youth, and when there weren't gay rights and homosexuality was illegal and people were jailed for it. I mean, that's just one example. There are many others, but
Yes.
we have made progress.
Yes. Yes.
But we really have we're going through the third transition in human activity. The first was when we learned to farm. The second was when we industrialized. Now we have to learn within our means, and we have no option but to learn how to do it.
This has been such fun. I'm really grateful to you for this. And I'm looking forward to seeing this revision of, what's it called? Losing Control.
It's Losing Control, Global Security in the 21st Century, published by Pluto, and it comes out at the end of July. And it's a paperback.
Excellent. All right, very good. Thank you for this. And now we've made up for lost time. This was a good conversation.
Well, thanks so much. You're very kind of you to have me, and
Right.
I hope I haven't spoken out of turn too much.
Oh no, it's been wonderful.
Great.
All good wishes. Bye-bye.
And you too. Yes.